So my name's Colin McKibben, lead developer advocate at SailPoint. And yeah, really excited about these SDKs that we have released. So this session, I'm going to talk about how to do advanced reporting using our APIs. So you may have used the search feature in the UI to create some reports to get data from SailPoint or from IdentityNow. But you may have noticed that there are certain reports that you can't do. Maybe it's not possible via the UI, or there's data you just can't access. So this is where the APIs come into play. So the APIs allow you to get access to data that search can't provide, and it also allows you to format that data in a way that's easier for you to process later. So in this session, I'm going to use the TypeScript SDK to create a custom application that will leverage our APIs to create reports that may not be possible via the user interface. So to start this, there's some tools that we'll need to get this working. So for this example,
I think we're seeing the wrong screen. We see your middle one.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yep, so for this demonstration, we're going to have some tools for this. We're going to need Node.js and NPM, the package manager. It's because what I'm using is TypeScript. That's a JavaScript-based program, so we'll need those tools. I already have those installed. So if I open up a terminal, you can see here I got Node already installed. So that's going to be my runtime environment. Next, I need to create a project directory that's going to hold my code. So I'm going to make a new directory. I'm going to call it Advanced Reporting. I'm going to go into that. This is easiest done if you're on like a terminal or PowerShell or something where you can type these commands in. All right, so to initialize the project, I already have npm installed, so I'm going to run npm I, which means shorthand for install. We're going to install TypeScript. We're going to save that to our development environment. So this will install the TypeScript runtime environment. Okay, so that is installed. Next, we need to initialize our TypeScript project. So we're going to do this command, npx tsc init. This will initialize our TypeScript project. And now, if I print out the contents of my directory, we have the basics that we need to get up and running. Next, I'm going to switch over to VS Code, which is a free IDE. It works really well with JavaScript applications, has very good IntelliSense. So I'm going to open up that directory that I just created in VS Code. Okay. So next up, I need to add some packages or dependencies to my package.json file. This tells my project what dependencies I need in order to run my code. It'll automatically install these things, so I just got to declare them here, and then we can get them installed. So there's quite a few dependencies. I already have a project open that has these, so I'm just going to copy and paste them in. So you can see we have a dependency on the SailPoint API client. So our TypeScript SDK is in NPM. So nothing special you have to do here, just declare it in your dependencies and it'll automatically be installed. There's a few other dependencies we'll get into later, but that's the most important one. I'm also going to set up a few scripts. These are shorthand commands that allow me to run my application much easier. Okay, so I have my package.json set up. Next, I'm going to open up a terminal. And I'm going to type npm install inside my project. This will install all of the dependencies that I have specified here. Okay, so that was successful. And the last step is to configure your secrets for the APIs to be called. So just like we need to have a client ID and secret when using Postman, you also need secrets for the SDK in order for it to be able to call out to your IDN tenant and make those requests. Now there's two ways to do this. One is to use environment variables. So if you go to the TypeScript SDK in our open source GitHub, the process for adding those environment variables is defined there. But there's another way that will be announced tomorrow that makes this much easier, and that's the way I have set up here. So I'm not going to do the environment variables, just know that my environment's already set up using this secret way. Okay, so our project is set up and ready to go. Next, I am going to create a folder. We'll call it source. This is where my source files will go. And then I will create my first file under there, the index file. This is kind of the main program where all of the execution will start. One more file to create, and that is a module that will hold the first part of my code that I will use to demonstrate the SDK. Okay, so now we can get on to building our code that will do some more advanced reporting for us. So let's take the Accounts API, for example. Let's say we want to export all uncorrelated accounts from a specific source into a CSV file. That is the ultimate goal that we are trying to do. Now, something to note, the search UI does not actually index accounts, so you can't use search to find accounts. You have to use the Accounts API. And so that's where this kind of code comes into play. You're able to get that data into a CSV file. So to start, let's create a new function. Let's start simple. Let's just get accounts. Let's not worry about any filters, any sorting. Let's just get the accounts. To set up the TypeScript SDK, I first need to create an API config. So we'll create this object. Now you can see IntelliSense is already recognizing that the SailPoint API client exports something called a configuration. So I can just auto-complete that. It automatically imports it for me. Makes that very easy to do. Next, I need to set up the API object that will actually be able to call the Accounts API. So every API collection has its own object that you need to instantiate. So since we're calling the Accounts API, I need to create an Accounts API object. Once again, that gets automatically imported. This does require a configuration, the one we just created on line 4. That configuration is empty. We'll talk more about what you can put in there later, but for now, we're just going to supply the API config here. It doesn't do anything at this point. All right, let's actually invoke a request using the SDK. So I'm going to create a variable to hold the response data. And we'll do API dot. And again, IntelliSense is picking up all of the different endpoints and operations that we can apply to the Accounts API. So in this case, I want to list accounts. I'm not going to give it any parameters, and I'm just going to return the data that it gives back. So that is our first function created. Now I'll go back to index, which is our main file that all this code will be run from. Going to import that module that I created so I can actually invoke the code in part 1 that I did just now. Going to create a main function. This will hold the main set of code that we're actually going to run. Now I can say, let's do part1.getAccounts. That's the only function I've created so far in terms of reporting. Now we want to print that out to our console so we can see what data was returned. So I'm just going to supply the data in a console.log message, save that, and now I can do an npm start, and that should run our program, and we should get some accounts back. Well, it doesn't seem to be returning anything. Oh, I know why. You can all debug along with me. I forgot to actually call my main function. Helps when you invoke the function. There it is. Yep, so you can see lots of accounts returned. It's not in a particularly useful format, not something you can actually use for auditing or reporting purposes. So let's next, before we get to making it into a more readable format, let's do some more stuff. Let's apply some filter parameters to this getAccounts function. All right, so I will create a new variable here called parameters. And this is where I can supply things like query parameters to apply to the list accounts that we're going to call. So filters is a common query parameter that you can use on collection resources. In it, I'm going to filter by a certain source. And I'm also going to say, only give me uncorrelated accounts. Okay, so to pass these parameters in, all I have to do is add it to my list accounts function. And now we should get fewer accounts back. So if I run this command again, you can see we have fewer results. That's because it's only getting accounts for this particular source and that are uncorrelated. Okay, so next, let's talk about pagination. So if you have tons of accounts, more than 250, maybe you have thousands of accounts, not unheard of, you're going to have to use pagination to make sure you paginate through all the records and get everything back. Because by default, by calling list accounts, you're only going to get up to 250 accounts. So to do pagination, I'm going to comment this out. We're going to create a new line. And instead of calling the list accounts directly, we're going to use the paginator. Now the paginator works like this. You have to supply the API object that you created, then the method or the endpoint that you're trying to invoke, in this case list accounts, any parameters that you want to pass, so I do have some filter parameters. And then finally, there's an increment. So the increment allows you to specify what the limit of that request is going to be, and then how much it's going to offset for each page call. So if I say 10, that means every API call that the SDK is going to make is going to have a limit of 10, and it's going to increment each API call by 10. So it's going to get the first 10, then the second 10, then the third 10, until it has no more records to get. So it will handle all the looping of the pagination until there's no more records for you. You just have to specify how many records you want within each call. So if I say 2, save that. One more thing, I have to await this. There we go, no more errors. We should see a few pagination calls being made until it gets to the end of the accounts list. So that went by pretty quick. You may have missed that. I'll scroll to the top here. There's not too many accounts. But you can see the debug logs. It's showing that, yep, the paginator it keeps calling each page, offsetting it by 2 until it gets to the end and there's no more records to return. So that paginator makes pagination pretty darn simple. Okay, so now we have paginated. We make sure that we get all of the records that match our filter criteria. Now, let's take a look at this. What's being returned in each request? Well, there's a lot of data here. A lot of data that maybe we don't care about in our report. So something that you might want to do is filter out a lot of these fields so you only get the fields back that you really want to report on. Now, the search UI and the search API can do this pretty well. They have built-in functions for specifying which fields you want returned, but our APIs don't have that option. So to do that, you're going to have to implement that in code. So there's more than one way to do this. For example, I could create a new accounts object. And then I can iterate over each record that's returned in this data object. I can use something like a map function, which basically says for each account in this response that we get, perform some action, and then return the resulting data. So this is where we can say, okay, I don't want all of those fields. I only want maybe the name. And then I can say the name is going to be supplied by the account.name. Maybe I want the email. And then finally the manager. Now, instead of returning this original data object, I'm going to return this new accounts object, which should be the filtered set of fields that we got from our response. So instead of seeing all of this data here, it should be much more condensed. And there it is. So you can see we only have 3 fields being returned now. So that's great. I mean, if you're talking with an API that has tens, dozens, maybe hundreds of fields, this makes it a lot easier to create reports that are readable. Now the last step is, let's convert this to a CSV file, something we can load into Excel and manipulate further or do some data processing with. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import another package that makes it easy to convert JSON to CSV. So there is an open source package out there called JSON to CSV. I'm going to use the async option. And then I'm also going to write a helper function that will take the data that I got back from my request, convert it to CSV, and then save it to a CSV file rather than printing it out to my standard output in my terminal. I already have that function created. It's kind of just boilerplate code, so I'll just paste it in here. What you can see is the function is called write_CSV. It takes in a data response that we get back from our API. It converts the data from JSON to CSV. And then there's a little file handler here that will write that data to a file name of our choice, in this case, output.csv. There is one more thing I got to import here, and that would be the FS package. That's the file system package. Okay, so now, down in my main function, rather than logging the data to my terminal, instead, I'm going to use my write_CSV function, pass in the data that I got back from my getAccounts call, and that should create a file called output.csv that is formatted in CSV. Okay, as you can see, CSV data is saved. We now have a file that is a CSV file, and indeed, we got our headers, we got our comma separated values. I can import this into Excel and do further things with it. Okay, so that's part 1. Part 2, we're getting a little more advanced. So not all of our APIs are going to provide adequate filtering options that will fit your needs. Unlike search, which is very robust and able to really fine-tune those queries, our APIs are limited to whatever filter parameters they provide, which in some cases might not be enough. However, you can, in code, add some more filtering. It usually involves getting more data than you want from the API, but then further filtering those results in code. So for this, I'm going to create a new function. Again, I'm going to initiate my API config. And this time, I'm going to use the access request approvals API. So as I was saying earlier, the access request approvals API has a limited set of filter options available directly on the API. But let's say I want to get all access request approvals where the state is approved and the request type is grant access. Not something you can do from the API directly, but you can do it in code. So first, I'm going to get the data, making an API call. I'm going to list the completed approvals. And we'll up our pagination limit here to, we'll say 250, which is the max. Okay, so now I'm going to create a new object. We'll call it requests. I'm going to again loop over the data that I received from my API request using the map function. And for each request, this is where I do my more advanced filtering that's not available directly on the API. So first, because the completed approvals returns a ton of fields, I'm first going to limit which fields are returned. So I'm only going to get these fields back. And then I'm going to do another variable, filtered requests. This time I'm going to use a filter function instead of a map function, which will reduce the amount of data I have here based on some if-else statement. So for each request, I'm going to say, okay, does the request.state equal approved? And does the request.request type equal grant access? So for each request in the data that we got back from the API, if it matches this condition, it will be saved to our filtered requests list. So finally, I can just return my filtered request object, and that will have my filtered down API. I have to make sure I import that module. And now I call part 2 dot completed approvals. And let's see what we get back. Okay, so we got, looks like 3 completed approvals back. Let's check to make sure this filtered correctly. So we should only get something that was approved in grant access. And you can see here, yes, they are only approved in grant access. So again, that's one way that you can further extend the filtering options available on APIs, is doing it in code. Okay, so sometimes an API response provides reference objects. Maybe it's an owner ref where it contains an ID for an identity and a name, but you need more information about that owner. Maybe their email, or are they a manager? Now the API is not going to return that to you in that API call, so you have to make subsequent API calls to expand on that data. So this part is all about expanding data with multiple API calls. So again, I'm going to initiate my API config. This time, I'm going to do something a little different. First, make sure I import this correctly. There we go. Instead of leaving the API config blank, we're going to actually do something with our config. And one of the things you can do is specify a retries config. So you may have recalled from my first session, I talked about rate limiting. There's 100 requests per 10 seconds per token. When you're expanding data via multiple API calls and you're doing that asynchronously, there's a good chance you might run into some API rate limiting. So we have to make sure we add some retry logic so that if we receive that 429 response code saying, hey, you're going too fast, slow down, we handle that appropriately and our program just doesn't exit in a failure. It'll actually wait and then try again once the rate limit is up. So to do that, I can specify the number of retries I want to attempt before giving up altogether. We'll say 4 in this case. We'll do a retry delay. There's a built-in function called Axios retry.exponential delay. That means every time it retries, it's going to wait a little bit longer for the next retry until it reaches the retry limit. And then on retry, we're going to give it a little handler function. I'll just paste that in there for time's sake. So on retry, it will print out a message saying, hey, we reached a rate limit. We're going to retry in this number of times. So that is how you can actually configure rate limiting for your APIs. Okay, so next, I'm going to do a public identities API because I need to get information about an identity in order to resolve that owner ref. Just to make sure I can get through this, I'm going to paste this here and we're going to walk through it. So I initiated the public identities API. I gave it the retry config, and then need to make sure I import my part 2. There we go. Okay, yep. So I'm going to get my completed approvals again, this time using the part 2 function that I created, the completed approvals. And then to expand on that data, so if we recall, it's not the most friendly way to see this, but yeah, you can see the requested for and reviewed by are the 2 last columns here. Those are just identity IDs. That's not very helpful. Maybe we want the name of those identities. So what this does, we get our approvals. For each approval that we have, we are then going to make a call to our get public identities. Then for each identity, we're going to apply that to the correct reviewed by field in our approvals. So basically, we're looping over every approval that we got here. We are making a call to list public identities using this identity ID to get the user name, or I think the user email in this case. And then we're going to supply that email as the reviewed by instead of that identity ID. We're going to do this asynchronously because if you do it synchronously, one at a time, and you have hundreds, thousands of records that you're iterating over, it could take a long time. So by doing it asynchronously, your computer then can make multiple requests at the same time. All right, so back to our main function. I'm going to call that function I just created. And now, instead of seeing these identity IDs at the end, we should see email addresses. Yep, so at the very end, that's the one I replaced. Instead of an identity ID, you can now see an email address. So that is a method that you can use to expand data on an API call that maybe has an owner ref or some other reference that you need to get more data about it. So that concludes this session. That's just a taste of what's possible when you're doing advanced reporting with APIs. There's certainly more you can do. The sky is really the limit when you're coding your own integrations, but I hope that sparks some ideas. If you have any questions about it, reach out to me in the dev forum or in Discourse, Discord, and I'll try to answer as I can. So thank you.